And they say nothing happens in August in Washington, D.C. Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars, and it's my privilege to welcome you here to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. And it's also my duty to ask everyone to check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage, and I'm sure on the National Review page, following today's program. Opening our session this morning is Genevieve Wood. Genevieve serves as senior contributor to the Daily Signal. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, John, very much. Well, good morning, everyone. I am Genevieve Wood of the Daily Signal. We're the news organization here inside the Heritage Foundation. And on behalf of President Jim DeMint of Heritage and my Heritage colleagues, along with our friends at National Review, we welcome you to this event. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot going on in the world, but certainly something that has caught the attention of many Americans is the whole issue of our border. Is it secure? How that's affecting our country, how that will impact immigration reform as we move ahead. So that's what we want to talk about this morning. And I think we have a terrific panel to kick off our session. And then, of course, we'll be hearing from the governor. Just a reminder, we will be taking questions at the end of our panel this morning. We'll have microphones for you. So anyone who wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. We'll send a mic to you. You present your name and affiliation, and we'll go from there. So first, let me begin by introducing our panel. I'm going to introduce everyone, and then they will each make their remarks. First speaking this morning is Jim Carafano. Jim is the Heritage Foundation's Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. He oversees 4 centers here on the front lines of international affairs: the Allison Center, the Asian Studies Center, the Center for International Trade and Economics, and the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Jim is an accomplished historian and teacher, as well as a prolific writer. He's the author and co-author of several books, including Winning the Long War, Lessons from the Cold War for Defeating Terrorism and Preserving Freedom, and his most recent book, Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World. Jim has testified many times before Congress and is a regular guest analyst on television programs, both here in the U.S. and around the world. He's also a 25-year Army veteran, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He's a graduate of West Point. He holds a master's degree and a doctorate from Georgetown University, as well as a master's in strategy from the U.S. War College. Jim is going to be kicking us off talking about where we are on the border today and what the situation is there. Following Jim will be Rich Lowry. Rich serves as the editor of National Review, which is a position he has held since 1997. Rich began his journalism career in college at the University of Virginia, where he edited a conservative monthly magazine called The Virginia Advocate. He later went on to work as a research assistant for Charles Krauthammer, who I know many here know, and is a reporter for a local paper in Northern Virginia before joining National Review in 1992. Prior to his current position as editor, Rich covered Congress for NR and served as its articles editor. You've seen his byline in many newspapers, the New York Times, the LA Times, and others. He's a syndicated columnist and a commentator for Fox News. He's also the author of a New York Times bestseller, Legacy: Paying the Price for the Clinton Years. Rich will be talking about the whole debate over administrative amnesty and also where the GOP should be going in terms of how it thinks about immigration policy. Following Rich will be Professor Ting. Ting is the professor of law at the Temple University Beasley School in Philadelphia. He joined that faculty in 1977 and teaches in the areas of citizenship and immigration law and tax law. His articles and media interviews related to those subjects have been published in law reviews and newspapers around the country, and he's been a commentator on numerous programs, including PBS NewsHour and NPR. Professor Ting has regularly testified before Congress, including before the 9/11 Commission and the Judiciary Committees of both the U.S. House and Senate. Professor Ting was Assistant Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service in the early 90s, and he ran as a Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate from the state of Delaware in 2006. Professor Ting serves on the board of directors of the Center for Immigration Studies. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Oberlin College. Professor Ting is going to be speaking to us about the rule of law and how that specifically applies to immigration policies across the board. Finally, she's not here yet, but joining us shortly will be Kellyanne Conway. Kellyanne is the founder and president of the polling company and Women Trends. She's one of the most sought after and well-known pollsters in the country. I'm sure many of you have seen her on TV. One reason she's very sought after is she's often right. Her team were one of the few on the Republican side of the aisle to use correct modeling and predict the outcomes of many of the major races in 2012. She's a co-author of What Women Really Want, How American Women Are Quietly Erasing Political, Racial, Class, and Religious Lines to Change the Way We Live. Throughout her 2 decades in market research, Kellyanne has provided research for clients in 46 of the 50 states. But she's not just involved in the political realm. Her clients go from policy organizations like Heritage and Freedom Works to leading brands of other industries, including Major League Baseball, American Express, and Lifetime Television. Kellyanne, her company just put out a study on immigration and how the American public is increasingly viewing this issue. It just came out this week. A lot of interesting findings, and she's going to share those with us. So to begin, we have a great panel. I'm going to hand it over to Jim Carafano. Jim.
Thank you, Genevieve. Well, first of all, thank you for coming today. We really don't care where you stand on the issue, but it's an important issue in the facts that people are concerned about it, and they want to have a dialogue and exchange on it. That means a lot, I think, and that's important. So I think the contribution I want to make today is to talk about, on the border, how we got here from there. And this is something it's not just an academic subject for me. It's something I've been personally involved in over careers back from when I was in the military with the Cuban boat lift to over a decade at Heritage, where I've visited the border several times with local law enforcement, with federal agencies, and also trips to Mexico. So you can really start the history of the border in 1986 with the Reform Bill, because if you actually go back and read it, that reform measure, what it promised ought to resonate a lot with people today who talk about comprehensive reforms. It said, look, we're going to do an amnesty, we're going to clean the slate, and then we're going to fix the problem going forward, because we're going to deal with all the components. We're going to add border security. We are going to implement better visa programs so we can get the workers that employers need to grow jobs and grow the economy. And we're going to force internal immigration and workplace enforcement laws. So that was a promise. Well, we definitely did the amnesty. We didn't do so much on the visa reform and the worker reform and the internal enforcement that was promised. But we actually did enhance border security. And that's, I think, very interesting. Dave Mulhausen is a terrific researcher here at Heritage. Did a fascinating study several years ago where he looked at the available social science research on the border, and what he concluded was there was actually a lot of consensus about what happened, and that is we continually put more money and more resources on the border through the 1980s into the 1990s. Government actually did what it promised. It did a lot more border security, and as a result of that, the unlawful population of the United States actually grew. It was about 3 million. Eventually, it grew to about 16 million. So how did that happen? Well, in part it happened because since it was more difficult to get in, people that came in, instead of being more migratory in their employment, they'd come and do seasonal employment and go back to Mexico, because the majority of the population came from Mexico. Since it was difficult to get back in, they would just stay. And since it also happened to coincide with the rise of the economy in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, and there was a lot of construction, you could actually have full-time year-round employment by going from seasonal job to seasonal job. So, so people stayed more, so that bumped up the population. The economy was growing, so people tried harder to get in because the transactional costs are pretty low. If you got, in a sense, thrown back, all you did was try to come back again until you got in. So the economic incentive of getting in was far higher than the cost it was of getting caught and getting sent back. And then the third, of course, is that only about, and the estimates on this while vary a great deal, but somewhere between 40 and 50% we think of the population that's unlawfully present actually came in through a legal point of entry and then simply overstayed their visas. So border security, no matter how you wrap it up, doesn't affect that. As a matter of fact, the tougher your border security gets, actually the more growth you get in the unlawful population from people that come through legally and just overstay. So that problem continued to grow. And the next really big change happens on 9/11. And one of the things that 9/11 did was prompt the creation of the Department of Homeland Security that actually added some efficiency to what we were doing at the border, because pretty much until that point, we treated goods and people as two completely different things. One guy was in charge of goods, one guy was in charge of people, a different guy was in charge of internal enforcement, and they had no real incentive or requirement to actually cooperate with each other or other federal agencies. So one of the things that the creating the Department of Homeland Security did accomplish is they call it one face at the border, and we did gain some greater efficiency from how we address border security issues, and that was good. Not just because of being concerned about security at the border, but also recognizing that the border, both the northern and the southern borders, are economic engines for America, and that an enormous amount of economic productivity occurs because of the process of crossing the northern and the southern borders. And so the job of the security is not just to keep bad things out, but to keep the people's goods and services that are growing the economy in the Western Hemisphere moving. And there was a lot of effort put at that. So in 2007, when we talked about, the last time we talked about comprehensive immigration reform, the model that was proposed to kind of move us forward again was pretty much a repeat of 1986. So what was really interesting is, as that was being discussed, not shockingly, the numbers of illegal crossings at the border started to bump up. So again, just the promise of amnesty caused the numbers to increase. And then, of course, the bill failed. And the administration at the time said, okay, we get it. Okay, you don't want to do this, but we're going to continue to work on internal enforcement, and we're going to continue to work on border security. And they did. And the numbers, starting in 2008, started to go down. Now, we can equate some of that to the fact that we were in a recession, so that's probably true. But some of it was also due to the increased security. And those numbers continued to decline through about 2012. And in 2012, what happens? Well, you have the confluence of a couple of things going on there. One is you have the impact of military sequester, and that does impact border security, because a lot of the illicit border crossing activity, which is the movement of people, guns, money, and drugs, was as a result of the cartels. And the amount of interdiction that we did against the cartels significantly began to drop. I was down in Key West talking to the guys coordinating that back in the earlier part of the decade, and they said, you know, if we had twice as many assets, we still wouldn't have enough to interdict everything we find. And that was at a time we were growing the mission. The mission significantly atrophied, so the pressure on the cartels has gone down. So that put more pressure on the border. The second thing that put more pressure on the border was actually the success. We did a great job with Plan Colombia. A lot of the cartels were pushed out of Colombia. And what they did is they went to other places and they started to set up business. That combined with really, I think, poor interaction that we had with countries working on public safety and security missions in Central America in the last couple of years. The money was going to the wrong programs. We weren't working with those governments very well. And all that really led to a strengthening of the cartels. And of course, the other thing we had in 2012 was DACA, the deferred removal of alien children. And much like 1986, that was, whether the administration intended or not, we can debate that forever, that was largely put up as a billboard saying now is a good time to come to the United States because another round of amnesty is coming. And we saw those numbers start to climb in 2012 and mushroom recently. So that's kind of what has gotten us where we are. And you know, there are lessons to be learned from this history, and I think they're pretty clear. Americans all want border security. Everybody wants a safe, secure, productive border. I haven't found anybody on any side of the debate yet that thinks that's a bad idea. Having said that, we've never quite wrapped our hands around what it really takes to do that. You can't secure a border by standing on the border, because the border is just one step in a line of migration and economic activity that runs from Latin America way into Canada, both legal and illegal. So you have to address the system as a whole if you really want to change the behavior. So yes, good border security is part of that, but so is the enforcement of your internal laws. So is having worker programs that get you the workers you need when they need them to grow the economy and grow more jobs. And part of it is dealing with the countries in Latin America to create the conditions to grow the economy as opposed to just moving people. We've never put a solution on the table that does that. All we've ever done is let's have another amnesty, which is another magnet to overwhelm everything else we're trying to do to fix the problem. So we can talk about this all day long, but until we actually address the problem, rather than just debate of amnesty, we're going to wind up right back where we were in 1986. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Rich?
Thank you very much, Genevieve, and thanks to all you for being here, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for hosting us. The Heritage Foundation has a special place in my heart because way back in the day, I was an intern at the Heritage Foundation. I was a part-time intern. I like to think this wasn't because Heritage wanted to deny to me the full benefits and protections that are due full-time interns at the Heritage Foundation. But I don't know, Genevieve, sometimes I wonder about that. Actually, I grew up around here, and I started reading National Review in high school, and I would smuggle issues of National Review into the classroom and hide them in my textbook and read them during class. So what Playboy magazine was to most American teenagers, National Review was to me, and I would record episodes of Firing Line, the TV program, of course hosted by the founder of National Review, Bill Buckley, and obsessively focus on every detail of the argument and rewind to make sure I was following everything. So obviously I wasn't a very well-adjusted or popular teenager, but enough about my personal problems. I just want to underline what Jim said at the end of his very able remarks, which is that the border crisis is not really just about the border. It's about a broader breakdown in the enforcement of our immigration laws in the interior. These folks who have been coming across the border in increasing numbers in recent months, they're not trying to evade Border Patrol agents. They are deliberately going out of their way to surrender to Border Patrol agents because they know that they will be processed somewhere into the country. If they're kids, they'll be enrolled in school, and very quickly they'll become part of that broad category of people who are subject to the de facto amnesty that President Obama has implemented just through his say-so. And this is really the root of the problem, and all indications are that the president is going to make it much worse in coming weeks with a sweeping executive amnesty that very well may, on top of making the immigration situation worse, precipitate a constitutional crisis. So I would urge him not to do this. But over the last 6 years, I've noticed a very strong and distinct pattern, which is the President of the United States doesn't listen to me. I don't know whether it's something I said or what, but he doesn't. So I would also just like to share with you just a few thoughts about what the Republican Party's posture should be on the issue of immigration, and not just out at the border, but more broadly. And this is an issue that I think the Republican elite and the Republican establishment just doesn't get. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is that they have a very simplistic view of the Latino vote, which is that if you go ahead and have a big amnesty, you'll naturally win Latino voters. And that's just not the case. It's not that easy. We had this experience in 1986. Ronald Reagan signs an amnesty. The Republican Party share of the Latino vote in 1988 actually goes down. And I think a lot of the Republican elite shares the broader elite's disdain and condescending view towards people who think we actually don't need ever higher levels of immigration in this country. Earlier this year, during the debate over the so-called Boehner principles, when the House was still considering whether to take up comprehensive immigration reform, I had a conversation with a top Republican who will remain nameless, a conservative in good standing, and he said, we have to move forward on this because if we don't, then everyone will know the nativists have won. And apparently by his definition, most of the Republican Party are nativists and most of the country are nativists because survey after survey shows that people do not want higher levels of immigration of the sort we would have seen in the Gang of Eight bill. And finally, the Republican establishment is obviously very close to big business interests who are desperate for higher levels of low-skilled immigration, more guest workers, because they love the idea of cheap labor. And this really gets, for me, to the crux of the matter. I believe, with many of my colleagues who have been arguing this for a while now, that the Republican Party is over-invested in the entrepreneurial idea. Entrepreneurs are important. Financiers are important. Big business is important. But there are also people out there called workers. And I believe it's very important for the Republican Party to reconnect with its original founding ideal as a party that believed in the inherent worth of all labor, which means you have equal dignity as a worker, whether you're working sweeping the streets or whether you're vice president of the United States. Okay, that might not be the best example. You probably have more dignity if you're sweeping the streets. But the fact of the matter is the Republican Party cannot truly be the party of work and the party of workers the way it should be if it's insistent on importing ever higher levels of low-skilled labor to compete with native and immigrant workers down the income scale who are already here. And I have to tell you, the next time I hear a Republican strategist or a Republican politician say that there are jobs that Americans won't do, that person should be shot, he should be hanged, he should be wrapped in a carpet and thrown in the Potomac River. That's what they did to Rasputin. I think it was a different river, but let me tell you, it works. And the fundamental American attitude towards work is captured in a story about Calvin Coolidge's son. And it was after Calvin Coolidge had become president. Calvin Coolidge's son was out working in a hot field that summer. And some snotty kid came up to him and said, you know what, if my daddy was president of the United States, I wouldn't be out here working in this hot field. And Calvin Coolidge's son said, you know what, if your daddy was Calvin Coolidge, yes, you would. Now, that's the American attitude towards work. In 1861, the great founder of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, said, whatever is calculated to advance the condition of the honest, struggling, laboring worker, I am for that thing. And it's long past time that the Republican Party realizes that mass, low-skilled immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, is not one of those things.
Rich Lowry, thank you very much. Professor Ting.
It's a pleasure, pleasure to be here, and I associate myself fully with the previous remarks of both Rich and Jim. Let me say that both my parents were immigrants, and of course, all Americans should admire and respect immigrants. We're not nativists, right? I mean, but that's not the issue. The issue is how many, given the fact that we admire and respect immigrants, given our immigrant tradition, how many, and specifically the issue is, do we let everyone in the world who wants to come here, right? Or alternatively, are we going to enforce some kind of limit? Now, I'm a lawyer. Lawyers like to think they can argue both sides of every question. Me too. If we had all the time in the world, I could argue both sides of those questions. But that's the choice we have to make. Are we going to let every single person in the world who wants to come here to take their shot at the American dream come here? Or are we going to enforce some kind of numerical limit? That's a choice. It's a hard choice, especially hard choice for elected officials, because neither of those choices is really appealing. Open borders, let everyone in, that's not going to sell. Everyone knows that. You can't take that position. But enforcing a limitation means you have to turn around people who look a lot like our ancestors, who just want to work hard, take their shot. They're not criminals, they're not national security threats. We have to say no to them. And if they come in violation of our laws, in order to enforce our laws, we have to remove them from the United States. And there are a lot of people in the United States who say, oh, that's too hard. We can't do that either. We can't have open borders, we can't let everyone in, but we can't really enforce the limitation either because that's too hard. Give me a third choice. Well, there isn't a third choice, but people think there is, and they're making one up as we go along. Here's the third choice that they've come up with. Let's pretend we have an immigration system, but let's not enforce it. You think anyone will notice? And if a lot of people come in illegally, we'll just give them a big amnesty, and that'll be the end of it, right? As a number of elected officials in this town have said, we're going to deal with this issue once and for all, get it off our plates, never deal with it again. Guess what? It doesn't work that way. And as Jim has explained, we've done this before. Now, I was walking past City Hall in Cambridge, Massachusetts recently, and if you ever get there, look up on the front of City Hall, and here's what you'll see. Forgive me while I read this. God has given commandments unto men. From these commandments men have framed laws by which to be governed. It is honorable and praiseworthy to faithfully serve the people by helping to administer these laws. If the laws are not enforced, the people are not well governed. And of course, that reminded me of the current administration's decision not to enforce the nation's immigration laws. President Obama has gone to the Congress and asked for a big amnesty that will amnesty virtually all or most of the illegal immigration population and double legal immigration going forward. He hasn't been able to get that from Congress, and so he has instead initiated through executive order various policies, including prosecutorial discretion, which means that really the only illegal aliens who are high priorities for removal from the United States are those convicted of serious felonies or who present national security threats to the United States. If you don't fall in those two categories, the reality is, and it's been acknowledged by the former head of ICE, that you have almost zero chance of being removed from the United States. Through executive order, the President has unilaterally decided that illegal aliens who entered the U.S. before the age of 16 ought not be held responsible for their illegal entry, and so should receive work authorization, not be subject to removal. More than 550,000 aliens have already been deemed qualified for that status by the administration, and as Rich has mentioned, the President is said to be contemplating a vast expansion of that deferred action program, possibly to include the parents of the people who brought these people, right? They got DACA because they were not responsible for coming, but we're going to give DACA to the parents who were responsible for coming. I'm not sure that that makes any sense. Is it any wonder that the U.S. is now experiencing this flood of aliens crossing our border illegally, including record numbers of minors, all expecting to benefit from the administration's policies? Now, if you listen to the administration spokesman, they say, well, you know, technically we need to explain to them that they're not going to qualify for any of these benefits. Yeah, technically you need to explain that, but I'll tell you, the people on the ground coming in across our border know better what's happening at our borders than the bureaucrats sitting here in Washington, D.C. And they know they're getting through, and as Jim says, they're getting benefits. The kids are enrolled in schools. They're being transported at taxpayer expense to their parents or relatives who are already in the country illegally. So they know the reality that they're here to stay. They're never going home as long as this administration's policies remain in place, and they're calling home to spread the word, hey, this works. It absolutely works. Find a reliable smuggler, get yourself into the United States, and take your best shot. So that is the reality. The administration says, well, on these unaccompanied minors, our hands are tied. There's this 2008 anti-trafficking law, but the Center for Immigration Studies has published a document showing that there's at least 3 reasons why this is just another administration excuse. The vast majority of these young people don't fit the definition of unaccompanied minors under the statute. They are not victims of trafficking. They're being smuggled. Their families are spending large sums of money to smuggle them into the United States to join relatives that are already here. And finally, there's an exception in that statute for exceptional circumstances, which members of Congress have already cited. Last point I'll make is this. What if a future president wants to cut income taxes to a flat 10%, but can't get Congress to go along with it? Could the president exercise prosecutorial discretion to announce that taxpayers refusing to pay taxes at the statutory rate will not be a priority for enforcement as long as they pay 10%? It seems to me that's where the president is leading us right now. If we want an imperial presidency, and we've been talking about one for a long time, if we want Cesar Chavez as our president, that's the way to go. Thank you.
Professor Tang, thank you very much. Kellyanne, I introduced you earlier and told folks that you had a great study coming out this week with a lot of good information on where the public is on this. We'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I was on the Excello when you introduced me. Thank you very much, Genevieve and co-panelists, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation. And I'd like to thank all of you for your interest in our remarks today, or at least your excitement in seeing Governor Perry and giving us some time ahead of that. We do have a big poll that came out this week on immigration. It's a very deep dive that goes beyond some of these very simplistic, useless questions, frankly, about do you support or oppose, quote, immigration reform. You can ask Americans fill in the blank reform and always get a high response. We support Q-tip reform unless we know what it's going to cost us and what the relative benefits and liabilities are to each of us and to us as a nation. So we took a deeper dive and a look at the immigration reform issue and the immigration issue overall. The entire 10-page memo is provided through a link, and you also have hard copies of it, so it's there for you to see. Let me go over some of the key results that I think also show some of the underlying empirical evidence to some of the remarks made earlier today. First of all, in 27 years of polling, I have never seen immigration at the level where it is in terms of the American consciousness. I think what has happened at the border very recently has brought into sharp relief some public opinion. Out of sight, out of mind is over. People know what they see, and seeing, of course, for the public is the first step toward believing. So what is it they see and they believe? First, you have 18% of Americans saying that immigration is a top issue that they believe Congress and the President should address. That's not going to happen if you ask it the traditional way, what is the top issue that Congress and the President should address? There it'll be 4 or 5% maybe on a high day. But when asking people, is immigration your top issue? Not your top issue, but in your top 3, not in your top 3, but in your top 10, and then not even in your top 10, which is really the way people think. 18% say it's a top issue, an additional 39% say it's not the top, but it's in the top 3. And so you do have a spiking of, I think, paying attention and just pricking the American consciousness. As goes the border situation, the lens through which many Americans are looking at immigration generally, most Americans say it is not humane and compassionate to have the children there. I have hardly seen, these shelters or safe havens set up in Nancy Pelosi's district or Steny Hoyer's district down the street from here. Everybody's got a pie in the sky of idea, but very little action on the issue. The media seem to be in Ferguson, Missouri, as is the chief law enforcement officer, Eric Holder, not down at the border. What Americans say about immigration and the President's role and Congress's role in immigration is very simple. They don't see either party having a natural advantage on immigration, and I'd like to make that very clear. It is true that President Obama's disapproval rating on immigration is over 60%. It's 4 points higher than his disapproval rating generally. But neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party right now sitting here has a natural advantage vis-a-vis voters on the issue. Part of it is a lack of a coherent plan, frankly, or lack of a coherent message. If even base voters can tell me what the 4-point or 5-point plan is from either party, I'm listening. But we did test the recently House-passed 3-point plan by the Republican Party, but did not associate it with them. 58% of Americans support and 32% oppose this plan, which basically has 3 main parts. Quote, extra funding for immigration enforcement, making it easier to return young illegal immigrants to their home countries, and restricting the president's ability to act on his own. That goes for any president, not just this president, to restrict a president's ability to act on his own with respect to immigration. In a separate question, 74% of Americans say they would like the president to work with Congress, not on his own when it comes to immigration. And let me read you some key crosstabs there that are in your packet. It's 74% overall would prefer the president to work with Congress. 21% say it's okay for him to go it alone. But it's a majority of independents. It's 81% of independents, 56% of Democrats, 75% of moderates. Really the only subgroup ideologically or politically that wants, that's on page 5, that wants the president to act like the Lone Ranger on immigration are self-identified liberals. There's a real divergence of opinion all throughout the survey between Democrats and liberals, and I would imagine those Democrats include many who are running for U.S. Senate this year as well. So what do people want? Well, the immigration issue is a big issue in and unto itself, but it is also, as has been remarked by my colleagues here, it is also seen as part of the overall economic equation. And just politically speaking, electorally speaking, if Republicans think they're going to run on jobs and the economy for the 5th election in a row, they're probably going to get the result that Mitt Romney got and Ken Cuccinelli got. If you only talk about jobs and the economy, it just means too many different things to too many people. And when you talk about jobs, frankly, to Rich's point, We've been speaking for a while also about the difference between talking to just the job creators, the entrepreneurs he mentioned, that you didn't build that. Most Americans do not fancy themselves entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs. That's about 7% of the country. Another 7% or so are the job seekers, who Rich was talking about. They're the folks who are unemployed, or maybe a higher number chronically unemployed or unemployed and stopped looking. But if you're only talking to the job creators and the job seekers, you're up to about 15% of the country. The vast majority of American households are job holders. And they are the ones paying very sharp attention to what's happening at the border and with immigration policy overall. They are the ones saying, why do we have 2, 3 jobs in our household? We're not worried about losing a job or replacing a lost job, but why is the job no longer enough? And it was enough when your grandfather had a job or when my grandfather had a job. And they do worry about the job security, and they do worry about everyday affordability and long-term economic security. And they look at immigration as one piece of that overall economic equation. So it should not just be looked upon in some hermetically sealed issues package. It is seen as part of the larger macroeconomic picture. And all throughout this survey, it's very clear that Americans don't believe that we have a surplus of jobs. They believe that we have a surplus of job seekers, and they are competing for these jobs. Americans overwhelmingly believe that Americans who want to do jobs, who are looking for work, should have a fair opportunity, if not a preference, to do that work. It turns on its head this cynical meme that illegal immigrants or immigrants do the jobs and Americans just won't do. That is just not true. When you actually put that question to people who are looking for the job, they are willing to do those jobs. They're not willing to do it maybe for $4 an hour under the table, but they are willing to work, and they are looking for these jobs. They do not think we have a surplus of jobs, just a surplus of job seekers. So 50% believe it's unfair that we bring in 1 million immigrants who can look for jobs while millions of Americans are having trouble finding work. 45% believe that the unemployment situation will actually get worse in the next few years. They're not looking necessarily at the monthly jobs report or listening to macroeconomic economists. They are just know what they believe in terms of their own financial wherewithal. 77% believe that U.S.-born workers and legal immigrants already here should have preference for jobs that they are seeking. 89% believe they should have that preference over illegal immigrants. 58%, because I've never seen this question really asked, but 58% agree that there are plenty of Americans to do the jobs in the construction, manufacturing, service industry jobs, service industries. 80% also believe businesses should be required to recruit and train more American workers. So here, a business cannot just sign up for E-Verify and say, look, we're doing our part. They also want businesses to help recruit, retain, and train a workforce. That does include many Americans who are looking for work. The upshot of this data also shows that politicians and leaders may be ignoring these issues. They may be ignoring what's happening at the border, but the American people really are not. And it's not as simple as just talking about the same issues over and over again. It really is recognizing them when people see something for a while and the seeing is the first step toward believing. They expect solutions. They expect action. There's a strong, I'll end on this note, there's a very strong consensus for just some very simple economic populist, not conservative or liberal, populist solutions on immigration. One, of course, is to strengthen enforcement of immigration laws. But when a politician says that, it's like them saying, I'm for equal pay for equal work. Well, who's not? Everybody, if you have an 80-20, Richard Worthland, God rest his soul, my first job in polling, my first boss in polling said to me 27 years ago, if you see an 80-20 issue, you actually wasted the poll question because everybody agrees with enforcement. But ladies and gentlemen, Americans see that as the floor, really far away from the ceiling. Very far away from the ceiling. So yes, they do agree with strengthening enforcement of current laws. They also believe in encouraging. This is an important word. So many people talk about denying and restricting. They believe in encouraging immigrants who are here, illegal immigrants who are here, to return to their home countries, particularly these children at the border, and encourage them to do that. And they also believe in limiting chain migration to the nuclear family. This is incredibly important to them. Finally, I will say, if you look at the final page, you see a tremendous amount of, I would say, tripartisan, both gender, regional, all ideology agreement that, yes, rule of law, national security, macroeconomic consequences are incredibly important, but really jobs is the primary motivator for awakening action on immigration. You see that Hispanics, even liberals pipe up there, independents, those making less than $40,000 a year, and 85% of blue-collar workers agree with this. They believe that protecting American jobs is an incredibly important point of this immigration equation to them, even if it's left out of the national conversation. Thank you.
Kellyanne, thank you very much. Thank all of our panelists. A lot of good information and good observations on the situation at hand, and now we want to get your questions on that. So I ask you to please raise your hand. If you have a question, we'll have a microphone come to you, and then just when you get the microphone, if you'll state your name and affiliation, we will go from there. First question. Gentleman here in the front. Here's the microphone.
Ken Meyercourt, World Docs. Do we owe anything to impoverished third world countries not to lure their best and their brightest through increasing the H-1B visa cap, as Heritage suggests, or as former Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour suggests, handing out green cards at graduation ceremonies?
Thank you.
Can I address that? Yeah, so I think it's great. The one thing I'm really excited about this panel, and I think the great thing that has been the strength of the immigration debate, is when you get people on the panel that don't absolutely agree on totally everything, that's how you actually have dialogue and move real forward. And so I don't actually think it's important that everybody agree on every absolutely thing about this. And jobs, I think, is a really, really good example. I think if the immigration debate, and I'm speaking from a policy perspective because I don't do politics, I just do policy, what actually solves problems. If the notion is somehow the immigration debate is the key to unlocking the human capital potential of Americans, I don't think that's exactly right. I mean, I would look at things, and which we've written a lot about before, is if you take the chains that government has imposed on the economy that limit the opportunity for economic growth and economic freedom, if you focus on education reforms that give people the skills they need to be successful rather than just throw money at it, if you have welfare programs that encourage people to get into the workplace and work rather than make them dependent, and if you encourage families that create the environment that create people that want to be productive future citizens, those are equally, if not more important things to really, really focus on, to really have human capital. I think human capital is the most valuable thing America has, and I think the ability to draw that from around the world is actually a huge competitive advantage for us. But the one thing that we all agree on, and I think which is really, really important, is immigration is part of that, because you can never get at a system that really works if you're just pretending that you have immigration laws and you're pretending that you have border security, because then you're not actually exercising sovereignty over your own country and your ability to choose your own future.
Thank you. I saw a hand over here.
Thank you, ma'am. John Gizzi, Chief Political Correspondent with Newsmax. Following up on Jim's remarks at the beginning about other countries and their economy and dealing with it, Mexico, after 12 years, went back to the pre-party that had been in power. And some people were nervous about President Piñera, and yet he appears to be moving in the direction of more market-based solutions, as well as giving people who have business degrees an opportunity to pursue private sector employment. The same could be said about the President of Guatemala, Otto Perez Molina. And my question is very simple. Do you see other countries moving in the right direction? And if so, how many years can we see it where people will not be inclined to come here?
Yeah, so we do this great thing called the Index of Economic Freedom, where we grade every country in the world on their level of economic freedom and opportunity. And I do think if we want a Western hemispheric market that actually works, and where you're not having, in a sense, distortions to the marketplace that really drive illegal immigration, at the end of the day, economic freedoms is a huge part of that. I do think, for example, that talking about all the countries in Central America, which we've seen spikes from, in the same thing is not fair or correct. I mean, there are different problems stemming for different reasons. Mexico, I think you're right, has actually done better. The problem I have with Mexico today has really been this pass-through. I mean, in a sense, Mexico has facilitated this latest round of migration from the Central American countries to the United States, and I think that is, I think that's wrong. And we've seen that problem before. We had a big influx of unlawful migration from Brazil a few years back. Basically, what people were doing is they were going to Mexico and getting visas because it was easier to get a visa to Mexico, and then they were just coming into the United States. And then we went to the Mexicans and we said, look, this is like, you have to deal with this. And they kind of cracked down on Brazilian visas to Mexico, and it worked well out. I think we need a similar relationship with Mexico. So it's not just the Mexican economy that I think is important to normalizing the markets, but also I think they have to have a responsible foreign policy in their dealings with these Latin American countries.
Over here.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, Ria Novosti. There's been a lot of discussion about the rule of law here, and it's pretty much been identified that the United States isn't exactly following our own immigration laws. But when it comes to international requirements to honor refugee statuses, or refugee status, I've spoken to a lot of people on, I'd say, the other side of the immigration debate who see the U.S. turning away, especially the young immigrants from Central America, as a violation of our responsibility to honor incoming refugees, which is also connected to the U.S. commitment to fighting the drug war in Central America, Latin America. So what is our responsibility to international law as far as refugee status with these immigrants?
I think international law places a more restrictive burden on the United States and on other countries than we think it does. The definition of a refugee is someone who's got a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. That's it. So if you're fleeing generalized poverty, if you're fleeing generalized violence, if you're even fleeing civil war, you don't actually fit the definition of refugee. That's just a fact under the international law. In reality, the vast majority of people coming through should be turned around, and the United States has laws on its books providing for expedited removal at the border, where we make a quick determination. Do you even have a credible theory under which you're a refugee on account of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion? And if not, we can turn you around at the border. Now, the president's saying, well, but I've got this 2008 unaccompanied minors being trafficked law that ties my hands. I can't use expedited removal at the border. And as I've said, and as CIS.org has said, there are good reasons why we shouldn't be applying that law. We're using that law as an excuse. But I think our actual international obligations are being respected under current law. And indeed, one could argue the United States has consistently gone beyond our international obligations. We've gone outside to bring in overseas refugees from refugee camps around the world to whom under international law we have no obligation, and yet we regularly bring refugees to the United States because they're in need of refuge, and we want to do our fair share in the United States. So I think we have a record of dealing with refugees in the United States which exceeds our international obligations and is one of which, frankly, we can all be proud.
Gentleman right in the very back row, go ahead.
Thank you. Joel Mandelman, I'm an attorney. I have one question for Professor Ting and one for Ms. Conway. Could Congress legislatively, consistent with the President's Article 2 power to grant amnesties, outlaw all of his amnesties, legislatively undo the deferred prosecution policy and so forth, or is Congress, because of separation of powers, barred from doing that? And for Ms. Conway, you've got all this polling data that shows that taking a much tougher line on immigration reform is politically popular. Why is it so difficult to get the leadership of the Republican Party to pay attention to these numbers, or are they just so emotionally or financially tied to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that no matter what data you showed them, they just won't budge?
I'll take the second first. Well, the leadership in the waning days of Congress, they passed this bill, and we tested it. It supported 58, 32 opposed, just the tenets of it, T-E-N-E-T-S, without explaining, who was behind it. I don't think blaming the chamber is advisable so much as something Rich Lowry said earlier. I think there's this huge misperception that and frankly, it's a cynical, if not elitist one, held by many, that if the way to win Hispanic voters is through immigration. And I think it's incredibly cynical because it treats Hispanics, first of all, in this country as a monolith. It's really the way the left believes all women care about is everything from the waist down. So let's just talk to them about abortion, which now they call, quote, women's health. And soon they'll just call it women's issues or women, or we'll just touch our temple and know what they mean. But so on immigration, it's similarly cynical. And it also is just completely disproven. Hispanics are like every other cohort in America in public opinion polls. They care an awful lot about many issues. Immigration is one of them. And I believe Phyllis Schlafly put out a masterful report earlier this year where she dissects, and everybody I'm sure can access it, Phyllis Schlafly, Eagle Forum, she dissects how untrue that just is. And I think it's got an awful lot to do with electoral politics, but let me say in no uncertain terms, whether I'm speaking on behalf of public opinion or myself, I don't think any politician should ever act on immigration being craven for votes on one way or the other. You have to do what's right, and you have to do what's right for everybody concerned. Fairness is a core governing value in this country. And so far the debate, especially now with the border crisis currently, is always about what's fair to the immigrants. But Americans are saying what also is fair to the workers, to the blue-collar workers, to the college students who are told, we'll just help you forgive your loans or pay them later or increase the minimum wage. What's fair to everyone? Is business being fair to everyone? Are policies being fair to everyone? So anybody who is doing anything on immigration with votes in their eyes really should take a look in the mirror and find another line of work, or actually compete for jobs.
And on the question of what Congress can do anything they want to do and are able to do. I mean, the reality is, in order to enact legislation under our Constitution, you usually have to get the president on board, or you have to override a presidential veto, and in the current situation, that's very difficult to do. We should not lose sight of the fact, however, that Congress has enacted laws already. We have very complicated immigration laws in place that were enacted by both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. And those laws set up a very complicated formula which decides who can come into the United States as a legal immigrant and who can't. And by the way, we have the most generous legal immigration system in the world, bar none. We give out more green cards for legal permanent residents with a clear path to full citizenship every year than all the rest of the nations of the world combined. So let's not lose sight of that. Congress has spoken on this question. They've enacted the laws. It's up to the president to fulfill his constitutional obligation to faithfully execute the laws properly enacted under our Constitution by Congress.
And just let me associate myself with that sentiment, because the problem is, right, if you already have laws in the books that the President of the United States is ignoring, what good is passing a new law saying he should honor the laws that are on the books going to do? And, the administration's defense is that just this is an exercise of prosecutorial discretion, and there is some wiggle room like that's traditionally been used, but it's been just for minuscule cases. Chinese students subject to deportation at the time of the Tiananmen Square crackdown. Well, you delay their deportation, but nothing that is this sweeping. And prosecutorial discretion typically involves you don't have enough resources to prosecute everyone, so a few people you let go because you don't have the energy and the time and the resources. This is entirely different. This is taking energy and resources and personnel from enforcing the laws and using them to administer an entirely new dispensation under the laws. Because whatever this new DACA is, if it works like the old DACA, people will have to apply, the applications will have to be reviewed, they'll have to get ID cards, so there'll be a whole new administrative apparatus devoted to this, created out of nothing in defiance of the laws that are already on the books.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me thanking our panelists, Kellyanne, Professor Ting, James Carafano. And I'm going to ask Rich Lowry now to come up and introduce our special guest, in addition to the other special guests that we've already had here. Rich, come on up.
Every guest is special.
Every guest is special.
Okay, great, thank you.
So we're all familiar with the Washington cliche that if you want a friend in Washington, you have to acquire a dog. But our guest of honor today really brings home to me what a cold and ungrateful city Washington is, because we are going to welcome a governor whose state is responsible for a disproportionate share of the Obama recovery. But does he get any gratitude from the White House? I mean, come on, Governor Perry shouldn't have to be slumming it here with the rest of us at the Heritage Foundation in the middle of August. He should be at Martha's Vineyard with the President of the United States playing 18 holes of golf, every day. But we know that's implausible because the governor has a real job and does not have that kind of leisure time. We've asked him to come here today to discuss a lawlessness on our border. Unfortunately, since the time we extended this invitation, he has become familiar with and a victim of an entirely different kind of lawlessness, and this pathetic joke of an indictment last week, which I believe is already backfiring. And just one sign of that is, have you ever seen anyone look as relaxed and happy in their mugshot as Governor Rick Perry? I have to tell you, the next time I need one of those, a new little picture for my driver's license, I'm not going to the DMV. I'm going to Texas to get a mugshot after seeing that thing. So without further ado, let's welcome a great spirit, a great friend of National Review and the Heritage Foundation, a leader on the border, as on so many other issues, Governor Rick Perry.
I don't think you do. I was telling Rich he never ages. Anyway, thank you all for the invitation to be here today. I refer to this as the little wellspring of wisdom in the desert of Washington, D.C. So Heritage, thank you for what you do, and to Genevieve for allowing us to come and be a part of this today, and to James and to Jan, thank you for the program that you just, and Rich, and I made mention as I stepped up here, you do, in fact, look eternally young. Some of you may not know this little known fact. Rich has been the head of National Review for as long as I've been governor of Texas. So, and that's a pretty lengthy period of time. I was telling him earlier that you don't get to stay around that long unless you're really good at what you do or just really lucky. So I suggest both of those are good things. It doesn't hurt to be both. As he shared with you, and some of you might have heard, that there's some interesting things going on back in my home state right now. There are a few public officials in Travis County who have taken issue with an exercise of my constitutional veto authority. These are fundamentally principles that are very important. Namely, a governor's power to veto legislation and funding and the right of free speech. I am very confident in my case, and I can assure you that I will fight this attack of our system of government, and with my fellow citizens, both Republicans and Democrats, I aim to defend our Constitution and stand up for the rule of law in the state of Texas. To all of you who work here at Heritage or at National Review, or for Republican leaders across the way, you have for 5.5 years been among the leading voices of the opposition. Every bit as much as William F. Buckley and Ed Fulner and the whole conservative movement of another era, you have carried the flag when it wasn't easy. For conservatives across America, you have kept the supplies coming. You have been there with reasoned arguments, principled criticism, and spirited debate. You have been there to show optimism and camaraderie. And that's the mark of every good cause from my perspective. You've been holding the ground as best you can. And more than that, you've been pointing the way back for a new conservative majority. See, we've got 29 months left on the presidency of Barack Obama. That's the bad news. The good news is that he's got exactly 136 days left until the next Congress convenes with a Republican House and a Republican Senate. He's going to get a little taste. He's going to get a little taste of checks and balances. He has an appointment, if you will, come January 3rd with constitutional limits. The election of 2014 is America's last chance to pass judgment on the Obama presidency. And something tells me he's not going to like it. You know, how different it is as we look back now when you think about how this presidency began. He came in decrying the smallness, the pettiness of Washington politics. He was the constitutional law professor who was going to raise our sights and make things work. He was going to govern a different way, uniting the country and building respect across party lines. And maybe you remember the part about improving America's standing in the world. There were all kinds of offenses for us to atone for. Our reputation, we were told, needed some polishing, and he was the right guy for the job. The constitutional law background has worked out in a rather interesting way when you think about it. 20 times, unanimously, the Supreme Court has had to set him straight on the limits of executive power. And when an American president is constantly exceeding his lawful authority, it doesn't exactly do much for bipartisan goodwill either. He's taken to saying, if Congress won't act, I will, which certainly stirs up a certain element of our society out there. The problem is we've still got two elected branches of government in this country, and yet for all of those inconveniences, we still like to do things democratically. We're seeing this misuse of presidential power right now. And one of the issues that brings us here today, and that is the integrity of our nation's security, our nation's border. We have a crisis on our southern border that is entirely within the power of the president to deal with under the law. But he won't fully and consistently enforce the laws as they're written, that is, requiring the protection of our borders against unlawful entry. And he wants to establish new laws, such as the amnesty of 2012 without the consent of Congress. So on the one hand, we're seeing a willful neglect of clear presidential responsibility, and on the other hand, we're seeing an aggressive overreach into the powers that don't belong to the president at all. When laws are treated this way, what usually follows are chaos and grief, and that's exactly what we've got right now. There is no briefing from far away that can capture the scenes along our border. So not long ago, I invited the President to come with me and have a look for himself. He happened to be in Dallas anyway on a very vital presidential trip to help the Texas Democrats. So why not chopper down to the border and take a look for yourself, see what's going on? He turned me down. And to this day, the President has yet to see the facts on the ground on our southern border, even though they are a direct consequence of his own policies. Children, 1,000 miles from their parents, they're vulnerable and afraid. They're drawn here by rumors of amnesty. There are these coyotes, there's smugglers, there's the gang members and lowlifes of other farms who are exploiting these children. And mind you, the unaccompanied children you've been reading about are just 20% of those illegally crossing the border. Many are adults. Some are working for the cartels, or they're involved in other serious criminal activities. Over the years, many thousands of violent crimes in the United States trace directly back to our porous border. These are thefts and assaults and murders that should never have happened because the thieves and the assailants and the murderers should never have been in this country to begin with. On our side, we have some very fine and dedicated people in the Border Patrol doing their level best under difficult circumstances. This summer, we began deploying up to 1,000 of our National Guardsmen. They're doing all they can, along with the public safety officers that I've directed to focus on criminal aliens. You see, the entire nation is benefiting from that. But the resources, the initiative, and the will all come from the people of the state of Texas, the people that I have sworn to defend, to serve. If the federal government showed half that kind of resolve, the border of the United States of America would be secure. Here's what it comes down to. Defending the border is not a political option. It is a constitutional obligation. And until the federal government meets that duty and secures that border, all talk of immigration reform is pointless because Washington has no credibility on the matter. You earn credibility when you enforce the law, and you lose it when you don't. Chaos is not the right condition for discussing long-term immigration policy. To those who wait on comprehensive immigration reform, here's my answer. How about we start with comprehensive border enforcement? Border security, after all, is the nearest front of national security. And I'm sorry to relate that this front is today largely undefended. So many people come across the border without us ever knowing about it. And from a certain angle, the cartels, as vicious and as brutal as they are, might be the least of our worries. What other bad actors are coming here? or for that matter, have arrived already. Where'd they come from? What'd they bring with them? Behind all of the political opportunism that has marked this debate is a profound sense of false security. After all, we are watching this crisis at our border at the very moment that other crises far away demand our concentrated attention. Just consider the events in Syria and Iraq, other places in the Middle East. They should have us thinking about the possibility of another terrorist attack in this country. We have been put on notice lately by the jihadist army that is right now charging across a country we were told was secure and stable. And if the astonishing seizure of territory these past few months is any indication, then we have every reason to take these individuals at their word. Here too, alertness is everything. Here too, presidential leadership requires the most candid assessment of the facts on the ground because the most fundamental interests of our nation ride in the balance. And here too, we have to understand the consequences of doing nothing. All of us, Republicans and Democrats, have a duty to put no concern of politics before the security of America. We have to take things as they are in the world today, not as we wish things were. That certainly is the way you approach things here at Heritage. So let me allow just a few things that I would share with you on this unfolding crisis. 1/3 of Iraq is under the control of the Islamist terrorists. Nearly as much of Syria is dominated by these same jihadists. The group itself, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. When this year started, most of us had never even heard of that group. They've been advancing in captured American vehicles, killing with captured American weapons and ammunition, taking cities like Fallujah and Mosul that American troops fought and died to liberate. All of this and more has happened just since June. And as the terrorists see it, they have had a triumphant summer, complete with this long-awaited caliphate. From far and wide, recruits are now flooding into Iraq, into Syria, to join in the offensive. We're talking about a movement that is now bigger than the better financed than al-Qaeda ever was. It's got nothing to learn from al-Qaeda about ruthless butchery either. ISIS fanatics have been executing non-believers, otherwise known as innocent victims. The poor souls who didn't get away have met the worst of fates. Beheadings, rape, enslavement, crucifixions. That's the character of this enemy. And in case we miss the point, they actually take pictures of their atrocities and post them online, calling it a preview of what we can expect in America. We've all seen the sorrowful images of the innocent photojournalist James Foley, forced to kneel and await his savage execution. The merciless killer was apparently British. And in this case, we were seeing a radicalized British subject beheading an American citizen in Iraq. Now, among other questions that come to mind, how many other jihadists out there are carrying Western passports? What missions might ISIS have for them? The danger of ISIS for the United States and other Western nations may still strike some people as a little remote. But for many Americans, of course, just about the last thing we want to think about is more conflict in Iraq and what that might involve. But we better get on top of this crisis by every means necessarily, because events are moving fast and the price is only going to go up from here. We have come to one of those moments when American action will be decisive and inaction will be consequential. There used to be a bipartisan tradition in American foreign policy, a basic willingness to unite in fundamental matters of security. If anything is left of that old spirit, we need to draw on it in a big way and right now. Sure, it is tempting to revisit and re-argue the old decisions that have already been made. Many on the left are going to say that the fatal mistake was made when we went into Iraq in the first place. Many Republicans would argue that the 2011 withdrawal from Iraq left some hard-won gains at risk. The pullout seemed to be driven by political calculations and not strategic ones. Still others take the view that no matter what comes next in Iraq, it's no concern of ours. Their attitude is, we gave it our best effort, but now we're done. And then there's the sense of regret and tragedy that still hangs over the failure to help Syrian rebels at a crucial point when it could have made all the difference. They could well have gained the upper hand against the Assad regime. Syria could have been spared a lot of violence and other trouble instead of becoming the ISIS stronghold that it is today. We heard from the White House that Assad must go. That was an opinion, not a policy. And so it all came to nothing. Just now, however, these and other questions, I'll suggest they need to wait for another day. We can talk about all the causes and the contributing factors all day long, and it will get us exactly nowhere. What matters in the here and now are outcomes that are still in our power to influence. We know what the jihadist objectives are in Iraq and Syria, so let's be clear and unequivocal about our own. Erbil, a strategically crucial city in the north of Iraq, must not be allowed to fall. The momentum of the fight must be reversed so that the cities overrun by ISIS can be taken back by Iraqi troops. In Syria, as well as Iraq, this terrorist army must be confronted with overwhelming force. In recent weeks, President Obama, his response has included limited airstrikes in hopes of finally slowing the ISIS offensive in the Kurdish north. He also sent 1,000 or so of our American military advisors and special operators. He provided humanitarian relief and aid to the Yazidis. And the least, well, the Yazidis that were able to escape and get into the mountains, the administration wishes, and for that matter, who doesn't, that this was just a humanitarian crisis. And when they talk about limited airstrikes, they place a great emphasis on the word limited. Yet, clearly, more airstrikes are necessary. Nothing less than a sustained air campaign to degrade and destroy ISIS forces is required. The Iraqi people are up against a terrorist blitzkrieg, and it went practically unhindered for many weeks. And even though these killers have seen glimpses of our superior power and technology, they need to see a lot more of it. And as for the many Iraqis who are trying to defend themselves and their country, they need to see more help from us. Air power is a major part of it, but it's also going to take more special operations, intelligence, and advisory support than we've offered so far. One more potent force for the good is the Peshmerga in the Kurdish region. They're a well-trained, disciplined militia. By every account, they have the will and the ability to fight back against the terrorists. What's missing are the heavy weapons they need to stop ISIS, counter its maneuverability, put it on the defensive. The United States and allies, if they are willing, should launch an immediate airlift and deliver those assets to the Kurdish forces. Peshmerga fighters, aided by American airstrikes in mid-August, have already thrown back ISIS in defense of cities that looked to be lost just a few weeks ago. The Peshmerga is a fierce and a ready force on the ground, and right now, they are in the best position to confront, overpower, and in time, defeat this enemy. In all of this, our allies, essential to the effort, and I might add, to the credit of the British and the French and the Germans, they have begun to act already. People in those countries, as in America, have been stirred to action in the last weeks by these chilling news reviews of the savagery of the Islamic State. The great powers in these nations, if they do nothing else, are in the business of preventing the worst from happening. And we know the worst when we see it. The atrocities of ISIS would command our attention even if we had no security interest, although we clearly do. And the list of countries with a big stake in defeating ISIS doesn't end with just Western powers, because it is so very extreme. Even by local standards, the Islamic State has clarified some very common interest in the region. ISIS has designs on Jordan, for example, and a serious threat to the stability of that country would not be a welcome development for other powers in the region. Even Iran is in this complicated position. For years, they sought to undermine our efforts in Iraq, and yet today they oppose ISIS. So we shouldn't assume that the people today terrorizing Iraq and Syria have powerful support across the region. They do not. And where they are operating now, they are, of course, universally feared and despised. Yet there are chronic problems and divisions within the Iraqi government itself. And these have hindered the country's ability to act when united action is needed. But the basic situation is this. Iraq is a democratic nation of 32 million people who are horrified by the danger that is around them. And with everything on the line, if we help them, Iraq can protect and defend themselves. In the weeks and the months to come, we need for these and surely other military measures in Iraq to become even more obvious and urgent. President Obama is going to hear warnings from his party. He's going to hear the word mission creep. And that's often a very valid concern. How could we not be mindful of that after what we've seen occur? And yet in this case, it seems to me that we'd be very wise to remember the ISIS version of mission creep. That's when they start following through on the threats they've been making by sending their recruits into this country. It may be a team of terrorists arriving with their passports and papers all in order, just like before. Or it may be when one or more of them slips across our unsecure border. But what rational observer doubts that such an attack is not part of their plan? And who thinks it's a good idea to wait and give them more time instead of eliminating this menace right now? We have a vital stake here. Reluctant as we might be to face 12 years of war in Iraq, and 3 years after we're told that war was over, it is no one's idea of where this nation hoped we would be in the summer of 2014. It's a long way from what we expected, but it's where we are. And our strength and our resolve today can steer us clear of far graver problems that are ahead. The demands of national security always require dealing with the threats as they come. Better still, we deal with them before they come in the faithful and vigilant protection of the United States. Thank you. You call it. You're in charge.
Oh, I love hearing that. Governor Perry put me in charge. I'll play Al Haig up here for us. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for just one question. And I saw his hand go up first, so we're going to give this here. We have a microphone. Please state your name and affiliation, and the governor will take your question.
Thank you, Governor. My name is Steve LeBlanc, and I'm with U.S. Border Security Committee. And listening to your question or your statements, is there a concern that ISIS may be coming through the southern border into the United States? That's the question I'd like to answer.
Certainly there is, I think, great concern that the border between the United States and Mexico is unsecure, and we don't know who's using that. What I will share with you that we've seen historic high levels of individuals from countries with terrorist ties over the course of the last months. I'll give you one anecdotal picture of what's happening. 3 Ukrainian individuals were apprehended in a ranch in far west Texas within the last 60 days. So I think there's the obvious great concern that because of the condition of the border from the standpoint of it not being secure and us not knowing who is penetrating across, that individuals from ISIS or other terrorist states could be, and I think that it's a very real possibility that they may have already used that. We have no clear evidence of that, but your common sense tells you, when we've seen the number of criminal activities that have occurred, and I'm talking about the assaults, the rapes, the murders by individuals who have come into this country illegally over the last 5 years, that the idea that they would not be looking at and managing any of those types of attacks from that region is not a good place to be. We need to have clear and compelling forces, both law enforcement and otherwise, on that southern border to send the message that it is secure. The border can be secured. It requires boots on the ground. It requires the aviation assets. It's one of the reasons that we asked the FAA for the use of drones to be able to look down 24/7 through all weather, night and day, and identify activity that's occurring on the border. We've yet to have that approval. And obviously strategic fencing in the metropolitan areas is very helpful as well. So we have a serious issue facing this country in the security of our citizens. We need to be very vigilant. We need to be using every authority that we have. The President needs to be engaged in using his presidential authority, and Congress needs to engage in securing this country, because I will suggest, as I said in my remarks, until the border is secure, there will be no conversation in this country about any immigration reform. Americans do not trust Washington to deal with comprehensive immigration reform until that border is secure. Thank you.
They said we actually have time for one more question.
All right.
So we're going to even it
Great.
out, and we'll come right here to this young lady. Thank you.
Hi, Governor. Thanks for taking time to take the questions. I actually have one political and one policy question for you. First, sorry, Casey Hunt with NBC News. Politically, you discussed your indictment at the beginning of this. I'm wondering why you view this indictment as political if the judge in the case was appointed by a Republican and then the prosecutor also served in a Republican presidential administration. Policy-wise, on ISIS specifically, you've called for more aggressive measures from this administration, but you stopped short of saying traditional combat troops should be used on the ground. I'm wondering if you think that we should send traditional combat troops back to Iraq.
When David Axelrod, Lanny Davis, Alan Dershowitz, Jonathan Chatt all say that this is sketchy, outrageous, totalitarian, and McCarthyite, I agree with them. And that's just on the Democrat side of the aisle. So I think all your options have to be open from the standpoint of dealing with this terror and this force in that country. I think signaling to your enemy what you are not going to put on the table is very, very bad, both strategical and tactical errors by this administration. We need to have all of our options open. It is too important to Jordan. It is too important to Israel. It is too important to the interest of the West in that part of the world to not stop ISIS. They are not going to stop in that region of the world. They need to be eliminated. They need to be eliminated now. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank again the Governor of Texas, Rick Perry.